Welcome, Liam. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Can you give me a little overview of what you do and what work at Wilkinson Butler looks like on the day-to-day?
So I'm the head of crisis. So day-to-day, my phone is ringing off the hook. We have clients on retainer, and then usually dealing with clients in crisis, usually when they're facing intense media scrutiny. So they're on the 6pm news, the front pages of the paper, and they're in a fair bit of strife. So my background is journalism, 19 years in journalism, started in talkback radio, then across TV with Channel 10 and Channel 7. So understand how journalists think, how they operate, and a lot of it is the other side of that. And it's about protecting and preserving reputation in times of crisis. So look, it's great work. I love it. Really rewarding. Get to meet some really interesting people across the business community in Australia. And I really enjoy it. You're helping people out usually when they're in times of crisis and they're probably at their lowest ebb and they need some good advice. So yeah, it's great work.
Does crisis PR often deal with just high-profile media personalities and sports players, or do you have the average Joe coming through the door in a crisis situation with their reputation being harmed?
You do. So yeah, it's both ends of the spectrum. And if it's an average person that is in the limelight and they've garnered some media attention where something's gone wrong, their governance hasn't kept up with the growth of their business. Usually when it's media-facing issues, that's where we come in. But more so the high-profile people, the big companies, the big execs, athletes, celebrities, TV personalities, where their livelihood is dependent on their reputation. That's where we come in.
Would you say crisis PR is on the rise because of things like social media? It's easier to pile on people in the middle of a media storm?
Absolutely. Media scrutiny is intensifying, it seems, every week, certainly every year. And community and political expectations, the bar is rising on that every year as well. So you need to keep up with all of that. Some of the crises we've seen in recent times, really smart executives, whip smart executives, been around a long time, great corporate reputation, big companies. And what we've seen is they're vulnerable as well. So you need to be prepared for a crisis. And a lot of that work with big companies is preparation, making sure that when it does hit the fan, that you're ready to go.
What are some of the misconceptions around crisis PR?
Well, in conjunction with lawyers, a lot of my work is with lawyers, probably about 80% of it. It's big in the US. I think more of it is it's starting to come through Australia. And some of your viewers that are lawyers will have experience with PR people and like, oh, gee, they just got in the way. And then there'll be PR people watching that say, oh, geez, lawyers are a pain. I want to get out and say this, and this. And they're stopping it. But I love working with lawyers. It is one of the most rewarding parts of my job. I find it really interesting. And I feel like my philosophy is that the PR strategy has to be in lockstep with the legal strategy and that the two can coexist and support each other. So there's the court of law and then there's the court of public opinion. So the court of public opinion, that's my domain. So you might have a listed company, a CEO, a high-profile person in the news, and we all know the wheels of justice move very slowly, sometimes at a glacial pace. And these people can't afford to wait 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years in some instances, because their share price will be in the toilet, their company will be gone, they'll be losing millions of dollars, their reputation will be gone, and they might be found not guilty at the end of it. But their livelihood is just shot to pieces. So for me, the court of public opinion doesn't have a law degree. There's so much nuance there, and that's where we come in to fill the gaps. And it's my job to ensure that the reporting is fair and accurate. And if it's not, to come in and fix that up. So yeah, it's an interesting space, really interesting space, and I think it's becoming more and more prevalent.
And it seems that lawyers have an aversion to speed. Usually we try to be slow, I don't want to say slower in our pace, but highly accurate and highly detailed. And it might appear that that is incongruent with the media's desire for speed, efficiency, get a story out by the end of the day, it's the 24-hour news cycle. Are those two objectives incompatible? And if you're working with legal teams, how do you find a balance between those two?
That's a really good question, and it's really nuanced and depends on the situation. And a lot of the time with complex cases, you need to come in and develop a strategy and distill some really complex information and distill it into easy to understand, digestible bites for the media. But that's where the two have to really work in together. And sometimes the PR strategy, I need to take a back seat. And sometimes you are going to lose reputation in the short term to win the long-term legal battle. And I understand that. So that's where the PR strategy really has to sit in behind the legal strategy. But absolutely, there is a time, most of the time my clients will not say a word to the media. It's about managing risk, it's about managing reputation, and developing a strategy and thinking with the end in mind and the end outcome, and then working backwards. So sometimes there is a time to say something to the media from the client if it's a huge crisis and they're public facing and you've just got to talk. Other times it's not. Sometimes you might issue a media statement that I might write, or other times I might just call the journalists and brief them off the record. And the objective is to stop a story. A lot of the times I'll deal with the client, the story won't even make it into the press. Or it might originally be a big front page feature story. And then you give the facts, and then it ends up moving to page 16 and being 3 paragraphs. But where I come in is that conduit between the client and the lawyers and then the media. And so for me, I always pick up the phone and I'll ring the journalists. And dealing with journalists can be really tough and really tricky and really intense if you're not used to it. There's no playbook for it. Journalists are smart, right? They're out there trying to get their best stories, and so they should. But for me, when I ring the journalists, it's an information gathering exercise. So I want to know, who else are they talking to? What are they saying? What are the questions for my client? When are you publishing? Can we push that publication date back? Once I ask those questions and I get the answers, I have a really good idea in my head of where the story sits and whether it's wise to participate in an interview or not. And it always comes back down to the objective of the client. If I'm granting an interview, does this suit the objective of my client from a PR perspective and from a legal perspective? And if it doesn't, don't get an interview. There's also times where I've had a client, a celebrity client, who was in strife, and everyone was ringing for an interview. Daily Mail, Daily Telegraph, Channel 7, Channel 9, Channel 10, The Project, everybody. And he needed to say something. But we ended up doing one interview. And he's in that celebrity space. I had a really good connection into the Kyle and Jackie O show. Kyle Sandiland's manager is a good friend of mine that I started work with in Talkback Radio 25 years ago. And the thing about Kyle was that we briefed Kyle and Jackie O on the situation, gave them the background, and then they agreed to give him the space to talk. And there was a 15-minute on-air slot. So we went with that, and we just did the one interview, and then News.com, Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail, all the rest of them followed off the back of that interview. And why I said no to The Project was 99% of their interviews are pre-recorded. So they chop it up, condense it together, and then that nuance doesn't get out there. So, look, every situation is different, but I tend to always err on the side of caution and less is more. That's
really interesting, what you're saying about being very selective about who you're interviewing with, and even if it's just one interviewer, being able to also understand or build that relationship with them beforehand, and to have that relationship ready, which is the benefit of working with someone like you, is you've already got the contacts with the media and you've built that relationship. So when it comes to a crisis situation, it's a lot easier to harness a narrative that you're going to go into that interview with.
And you've got to know who's who and is it, who you can trust, who you can't. The media have their narrative. Journalists are chasing good stories. That's their job. That's their prerogative. When you're a journalist, it's all about exclusives. Okay, and so they want their story, but that just because they want a story doesn't mean that that's good for your client. And the way that different organisations and different journalists operate, you've got to know who's safe and who's not. So a shock jock on 2GB may not be the best place for your client to go and do an interview, because they're just going to get talked over, they're going to get shouted at, and they're not going to get a fair hearing, and it will sully their reputation, not improve it. So it's always just thinking strategically, knowing who's who in the zoo, who you can trust, who you can't, what you say, how you say it, when you say it, the timing, all of those things. So it's quite nuanced.
Sometimes there's a perception that silence equals guilt. And if I don't say anything, if someone doesn't say anything, well, they're hiding something. Would you say that that's a fair perception of silence? And is that something you take into consideration when you're discussing whether someone or strategizing whether someone should give a statement or not?
Absolutely. Silence, I had a client recently where they didn't say anything on the record because there was a big government inquiry, and the media was one of many stakeholders. There's absolutely a time for silence, and absolutely there's a time to just talk off the record. Where I see clients getting it wrong, they do one of two things, or they want to do one of two things, where they'll say, don't say anything at all, we can't change the narrative. Well, that's BS. That's where I come in and you have those off-the-record conversations. Or they just say no comment. No comment in the court of public opinion is akin to I'm guilty.
Yeah.
Then the other extreme of it is a journalist may go fishing and send an email and ask 20 questions, and they're just pushing the envelope, and people reply to every question and give far too much information, and they botch their legal case. So it's just knowing what to say, and I always err on the side of less is more. That there's facts, and facts are really important for journalists. If they get them wrong, you can change them on the run. But then there's just so much nuance and grey area and perspective, and that's where you need to come in and influence and use those relationships. But also you can't overcook it, so you can't spin. If you lie to a journalist and you feed them BS, my reputation's going to be shot. You don't want a reputation for that, because then you can't help your clients. So where it starts for me is being really selective with my clients. I knock a lot back, because you don't want to be put in awkward situations where you're spinning or you're saying something that's not accurate, or you're being loose with the truth. So it's my credibility and my reputation I hold really dear as well. You want to do good work for your clients.
And how important is honesty when you're making those media statements?
Everything, because you need to. The cover up is worse than the crime. Like people are so quick. Oh, we need to respond. Oh, no. Look, just deny. You need to think. This is where we come in and we think through the story, not just today, not just tomorrow, not just the next week, but the next 6 months. There's going to be a government inquiry or a police inquiry, and it comes out that you covered it up and you've lied. Your reputation is gone. Then you've got no credibility. So you need to be really careful with what you say. So, absolutely.
Yeah. You mentioned before that by the time someone goes to speak, often they've already been dragged through their mud, their reputation. They have had multiple media stories about them, some may be true, some may be false, but their reputation seems to be beyond recovery. Is there any way to mitigate that sort of process, mitigate the media pile-on?
There is. So I'll give you an example. So I had a client, Olympic gold medalist, former TV presenter, household name, very well known. And he was charged with inducing somebody to invest $2 million into his business, and the business later failed. And he had a current affair chase him for 10 years. This case is still ongoing. I was talking before about the glacial pace of the justice system. And he'd moved around the world. He was living in the UK and then in the US, and now over in Bali. And I was brought in just before the case went to court last year. And you Google his name, and it was horrendous. Gee, I'm going to help this guy. This looks awful. He described his own reputation as radioactive. So I got brought in, went across to Bali with his criminal lawyer and barrister, both esteemed, really good at what they do, sat with the client for a week. It was a really complex case, down a lot of rabbit holes, a lot of tangents. But what we discovered was there was a whole other side of the story that had never been put out there. by a current affair. They'd doorstop him, so that's that element of surprise. So they just sort of rock up at your house and get you at the server or outside a cafe. And I did a lot of that as a journalist, and it's good TV, but it's not good if you're on the receiving end. And we went through, and there's a whole other side of the story that just had not been told. There's a whole heap of evidence to back all of that up. So I compiled all of that, came back to Australia, knew that I was on really solid footing to take it to a journalist. So I went to a journalist that is very credible, has been in the business 40 years, one of the leading journalists in Australia, took him for breakfast, off the record conversation, took him through all of the detail, answered all of his questions. We set up a one-on-one interview the day before the case. And we knew it was going to be a tough interview. And that was great for my client because this journalist was going to ask the hard questions. And that's what we wanted. And my client had nothing to hide. And there was a whole other side of the story that needed to be told. And the journalist gave him the space to tell that story. And then the viewers could make up their own mind. So it completely flipped the narrative after 10 to 15 years of this awful reporting, and this other side of the story was out there. So the next day we went into court. All of the court reporters had seen that report. And because it was done by a journalist who'd been around for 40 years with so much credibility, there was a lot of faith put in what his reporting was. And then so I liaised with the reporters beforehand, let them know what was coming up that day. And as the different evidence came out in court, I was able to send them the documentation and photos and different reports of that to influence their reporting. By the end of the day, the person that had made the accusations against my client was running out of court with his hands up to the cameras, and he looked like the guilty party. And my client said to me at the end of the day, this is the first time in 10 years I've been able to walk down the street with my head held high because people know the truth and the truth is out there. So that's I think where PR and legal teams can really work and coexist and work together for the benefit of the client, and you can get a really good outcome. So that was really a really enjoyable case, and we got a really good outcome with that one.
What would you say to someone that may not have the resources to get a PR team and they need to do exactly what you just explained, mitigate that media pylon? Is there anything they can do within their own DIY way to help themselves?
Think with the end in mind, think strategically, don't do anything stupid. A lot of what I do is preventing people from doing stupid things. Don't react straight away. Listen, if you can't afford PR, listen to your lawyers. Think with the end in mind, think safety first. Think about your objectives and what you want to get out of it.
So we'll talk a bit about litigation now, and you touched on it a little before. You spoke about the court of public opinion and the court of law. If someone doesn't have a PR team and their lawyers are trying to PR up, essentially, and take on some of those PR responsibilities to try to mitigate the media pylon for their client, how can they're often really good at dialogue in the court of law, how can they manage dialogue in the court of public opinion as the lawyer themselves?
It's about getting ahead of the story and just knowing what journalists are going to be covering the story and having the ability to have an off-the-record conversation so that the journalist is prepared. Being a journo is tougher than it's ever been. So when I started as a journalist, you'd have one story to do for the 6 p.m. news, and you spend the whole day on that one story making 30 phone calls, making sure that you had every fact absolutely right. I was threatened to be sued many times, and never successfully, because I always got it right. Now with journos, they're chasing 4 or 5 stories a day, they're getting pitched a dozen stories a day. You're not just doing, for a TV reporter, you're not just doing your report for the 6 p.m. news, you might be doing across the sunrise, across for the morning show, across for the afternoon news, and you're doing all your social medias, you might be doing a podcast for the news, so there's so much on. So it's about making sure that the journalist is informed and they have the facts before you go into court. And look, that's where I come to try and take the pressure off the lawyers, but it's just the lawyer themselves. It's having good relationships with the journalists, making sure that they understand the story, talking to them before the case, during the case, after the case, so they get it right. And look, journalists want to get the story right. So I think it's just that, having that relationship and that open dialogue with the journalist and having those relationships, I think is really important.
So essentially, don't run from the journalist.
Running is never a good idea. Never a good idea. Look, where people, the interaction a lot of the time between lawyers and journos is on the steps of the courthouse. And that can become a circus, and it can be really hard to control. So the last few weeks we've seen Matt Wright, the Outback Wrangler, the Croc Wrangler, in court in Darwin. And some of his friends have looked at his mates, so they think they're doing the right thing to form this posse around him going in and out of court and knocking journalists out of the way. You're causing a circus. As a journo, you love that because it's great TV.
It's drama.
Right? It's drama, okay? So you want to try and take the drama out of that, control the situation. I had a client in court in Sydney and all the media were there. I briefed all the journalists beforehand. I had an agreement with them that they wouldn't chase him, get up in his face. I would let them know from what direction he was coming from. They would get their shots, and that once the case, couldn't say anything on the way in, but once his case had concluded, he would stop and he would answer every single question that they had until they were blue in the face. And it worked. So they kept their cameras on their tripods. They got their shots on the way in. They didn't hit him up on the way in. And he stopped on the way out after the case and answered all the questions. We'd done all the media training beforehand and he'd handled himself really well. But the journalists also understood the story. So it's just, you're trying to control that situation as much as you can. You just want to alleviate the drama and the stress and everything goes along with it. Because it can turn into a circus really quickly. I know we're going to talk about Optus. The Optus CEO was at a parliamentary inquiry a few weeks ago. She had these big burly security guards and the journo put the mic under the nose and the big security guard knocked the journo out of the way, young female journalist. Look, it looks horrendous. That then becomes a story. So you just need to control those situations as much as you can.
What I'm gathering is work with the journalists, like use them to your advantage. They're not immediately a threat. Yeah. They actually can be used to your advantage.
Exactly. And they've got a job to do, so you've just got to work in with them for the best interest of your client.
Yeah.
And sometimes, look, the big case, sometimes there's not much you can say beforehand. You can just give a generic statement that you're pleading your innocence and you look forward to the result in court, and you just give them a grab because they need a grab for the news. And then away you go. Judges, as we know, don't like lawyers providing ongoing public commentary during the case, so that's why you won't see lawyers and clients saying too much during the case. And you want to make sure the journalist understands what's going on in the background, but they're reporting what's going on in court. And then you've just got to decide whether your client is up for doing media. Like I advise a lot of my clients not to do media unless you're a politician and you're involved in it every single day. It's a really hard thing, and you need to be prepared. And if you're not, you can come unstuck and you can sell your reputation really quickly.
We had Optus's recent outage and the media and the public didn't respond well to the CEO's public statements. At best, it was out of touch, and at worst, it was patronising. And she pinned it down to the fact that it was a really complex technical issue to explain to the public and to customers. So what can we learn from explaining and communicating technical issues in the middle of a crisis so that we can get consumers on board with understanding and staying in the loop of what's happening?
Yeah, if you don't know, say you don't know. The problem with the Optus situation, it's sort of crisis 101 and everyone jumps on the bandwagon, and I don't want to be seen to be doing that. But there's some things there where 10 million customers were affected, and the CEO said, we put a statement out on social media. Well, those customers couldn't access social media because of the outage, right? They had Sunrise, the Today Show, every radio station, basically every media organisation in the country banging on the door saying, what's going on? Right? When you have so many people affected, 10 million people affected, the media is the conduit between your key messages and what you want to, and your customers. So use them. And the vacuum in communications had to be filled by the communications minister who knocked them over the head. So yes, it may have been complex, right? But that's when the comms people, it's their job to distill really complex information into easy to understand information for the customers. And if you don't know what the outage is, say you don't know, but we've got our best team working on it. We apologise for the inconvenience. It's not just saying sorry, it's how you say it, making sure that you have genuine empathy for your customers. And you over-communicate, you talk to everyone, you keep talking and talking and talking and talking and talking. and every update that you have, you keep putting it out there, right? So you're proactively going out to your customers and communicating with them. You need to fill that information void. So they needed to get out early and strong and just continue that on. There was just such a big gap. And in this social media age where, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, rolling news coverage, you need to be across that. You need to be controlling the narrative. And they lost control of the narrative. And by the time it got around to the end of the day, they'd completely lost it and she was on the defensive.
And what can we learn about rebuilding trust on such a large scale from a company like Optus?
With something that affects so many people, you need to be the one communicating. In terms of the compensation, you need to offer real, valid compensation. And it's that communication piece. And again, it's not just what you're saying, it's how you say it. The CEO became really defensive during these one-on-one interviews. And look, you don't know what's going on behind closed doors. The corporate affairs team may have been giving the best advice possible to the CEO and she didn't take it. Or the CEO wanted to take it and the overseas entity that owns Optus put the handbrake on. So you don't know, and I don't want to be too critical. But they needed to be filling that gap and owning the mistake and over-communicating. The trust that they've lost, it wasn't so much, yes, it was a technical outage that caused issues for people, but it was a communications problem. That's where it came down to. And it was really strange during the one-on-one TV interviews. The PR people were just oddly standing behind the CEO during the interviews. It looked strange. And then I remember Channel 9 did a story about a barber that was affected. Nobody carries cash anymore. So the barber was affected because people couldn't pay for their haircuts. And the CEO said, how could a barber be affected? It's a really snide comment and it just didn't go down well. And then the CEO made an apology to the barber on air and then personally rung the barber and said, look, I'm going to come down and see you and personally apologise. And then Channel 9 followed that up. And the barber said, CEO never came down and apologised. So do what you say you were going to do. Don't just PR it. PR is comms, but then action. It's got to be actionable. So, and it's not just what you say, it's how you say it and then following that up with action. So people believe you and trust you. And you can't, consumers are really smart. People pick up when you're talking BS. So you just need to be honest and genuine and authentic. I think largely as a whole, what it shows is that CEO is whip smart, really good corporate reputation, apparently the smartest person in the room, big company, plenty of resources, twice in 12 months. I think what it shows is, that corporate landscape out there is cutthroat. And as I said before, that the media scrutiny is intense and the public expectation and community standards and political standards are rising. So the communications needs to rise with that.
And the CEO obviously resigned very quickly after the outage. Do resignations of key executives signal some sort of insecurity happening within the company? And would you advise executives to resign in crisis situations?
Sometimes it needs to happen. You never like to see anyone lose their jobs. It's an awful thing, no matter who you are or where you are in life. Awful thing. But twice in 12 months, despite perhaps being the smartest operator in the room, the CEO failed at the comms twice. So she was not crisis prepared. And you could see that in the interviews and her snarky answers and a defensive attitude all over the shop. So the reality is, when you're a CEO and you're highly paid and you're a leader, you need to stand up when things are bad. That's what you're there for. So the CEO failed in that instance, and as a company, Optus needed a clean break from that, and there needed to be a changing of the guard there so the public could see that they were taking action. So she fell victim to that.
It's a shame.
It is, yes, but that's the brutal world we live in these days, and it's key for big companies and executives that they need to be prepared. RepTrak did a report the other day where they said it would take up to 3 years for Optus to regain their reputation.
Oof.
So how many hundreds of millions of dollars have they lost through this crisis? So that's just why it's important. You need to be prepared and you need to get the comms right.
So a couple of quick fire hypotheticals now. I'm just going to throw some quick questions at you for your answer. Bury a story or take it to the media?
If you can bury a story and it's going to stay buried, then yes, if it deserves to be buried and there's nothing legitimate there, absolutely. If it is going to be out there and you can't stop it being out there, then you want to put out the fire as quickly as possible. You want to. You're in crisis. You're at point A. You're in crisis. Point B, your reputation's on the road to recovery. So you need to think about point B and work backwards from there and think about those steps. So sometimes, if it is going to be out there, it's just jumping on the grenade quickly and putting out the fire, if you can, within the 24-hour media cycle, as opposed to it dragging on and on and on. And it's just having that perspective of where things are going to go, and it's that meeting that public expectation. So you'll find different companies will stray away from making a public apology, and then the media intensity will ramp up, they'll cop a hammering, and then after 3, 4, 5 days, they'll finally relent, when they should have just had that perspective to be able to do it from day one, and then the media cycle would have moved on. Never apologise or say sorry? Always say, if you need to say sorry, if you have done something wrong, say sorry. Absolutely. Take the heat out. Well, yeah, take the heat out of the situation. If you need to, if you've done the wrong thing, yeah. I wouldn't say always. It depends on the situation. What if you have a client that thinks they haven't done the wrong thing, but everyone else thinks they have? What do you do for that client? What do you advise them? You need to have a strong and honest conversation. And that's where I come in from an outside perspective. Internally in companies, people are worried about politics and worried about their position. So when I come into a situation with a client, I'm 2 ears, 1 mouth, really listen to their story without judgment, and then just provide a really objective summation of where they sit and provide that advice. Yeah. Sometimes these people have sycophants around them that don't tell them how it is, right? And they believe their own BS. So you just need to be able to cut through that and say, look, you have done something wrong here. You do need, I've had that with a client. He's getting smashed by Ray Hadley for 3 days, didn't think he'd done anything wrong, had a conversation with him. By the end of that conversation, he'd realised that he'd done the wrong thing and he made a public apology. Sometimes you just need to swallow your pride and apologise and get on with it and get better and don't do it again. Make the mistake once, don't make it twice. So if you need to apologise, swallow your pride, absolutely. It's a hard thing to do, but sometimes you've got to do it. Should someone do an interview or provide a statement? Only an interview where you trust the journalist and it meets your objective from a PR perspective and a legal perspective. If you are not equipped to do an interview and handle the heat and handle the tough questions, don't do it. You'll make it worse. You need to be really trained, media trained for that. A lot of the time, I'll provide a statement. Absolutely, it's often the safest way to go about things, and you can control that environment and you can control that narrative. Sometimes interviews can get away from you because journalists are good at prodding and poking and unearthing different things, and there's things that you might not want out there ahead of a legal case or in a situation. So, you need to be a pretty experienced CEO or politician or celebrity that's used to dealing with the media, I think, if you're going to put them in front of the camera. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Or any final thoughts that you have on anything we've spoken about? Look, I love what I do and I love working with lawyers, and the great part about it is just being able to use my experience in journalism and knowing how journalists operate and being able to help people in a tough situation. And I think as a society, we can be really quick to judge. So being able to help those people in tough situations is a position of great responsibility and something I hold dearly, and really enjoy my work and very privileged to do it. Thank you so much for all the great insight you provided with us today. I'm sure it's going to be absolutely invaluable to our viewers, whether they are lawyers, clients, media professionals, and you are full of expertise and fantastic case studies. So thank you so much for your time, and we really, really appreciate it. And I know I've learnt a lot, and I'm sure our viewers have learnt even more. Thanks, Liam. I hope it wasn't boring. I hope everyone got something out of it, and thanks for having me on. It was good fun.